Thanks, Stevie. I don't know how to tell if there's people on or not. Oh, okay, Stevie, I know we wanted to record this, and I'm realizing that I don't know how. So does it auto record or this is my first time doing this, so someone outside is humming the Jeopardy theme song, which I feel like is very appropriate for what's happening right now. Oh, perfect. That's great. Okay, it auto records. Awesome. So I think we'll just give it a couple minutes to let people start signing on. I'm like obsessed with why my hat looks crooked. Not that that's what I need to be worried about right now. Got my little topics over here. Feeling some butterflies, which is always a good feeling. So if you're signing on, I would love to say hello, and I would love to ask you to say hello so I can know if you want. Of course, you have the right to remain anonymous if you like, but I'd love to know who is online with us today. All right. So I posted some questions while I was pondering this topic last night. It's such a big topic, and I always want to like deep dive and like, you know, I have a tendency to kind of get into the weeds about topics like this, and so I kind of had to pull myself back from the brink and remind myself that this is such a large topic that it's kind of impossible to cover everything in an hour. But I did come up with some questions that I thought were really important to kind of think about as we start to think about the process of self curiosity and getting into vulnerability. And I posted those to the event page. So feel free to check those out. And you can either address them here in the webinar, or you can take them home and kind of think about them and, figure out what those things mean to you. And of course, I'm always available if you want to reach out and you have any questions or feedback. I always invite feedback because that's how I grow and that's how I learn. Um, yeah, so it looks like we've got just a few folks here. And for those of you who are newly joining us, I am inviting, not requiring, inviting you to introduce yourself so that I can know who's online. And of course, that's not, you don't have to do that. If you want to stay anonymous, that's totally fine. Stevie, can you hear me okay? I don't know. I'm going to give it just a couple more minutes and then we'll get started. Hi, Cassie. Welcome. Oh, good, good. You can hear me. Good. Nice to meet you too, Cassie. Thanks for joining. All right. So we will do a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions and you want to write them down, and we'll spend like the last 15 minutes, I think, doing a Q&A. But I think the way I sent this to Stevie, but the way I kind of planned on laying this out was just talking a little bit about who I am, what I do, kind of my journey with vulnerability, and learning how to get into the process of self-curiosity and learn how to trust, which was really hard for me to do. And from there, I would kind of go into a little bit about guilt and shame, core values, which is really important, thinking about our personal beliefs and how those beliefs kind of show up in our day-to-day. And then we'll talk a little bit about changing the narrative, kind of addressing some of the dialogue that goes on in our head, those kinds of thoughts that tell us, we don't deserve to be heard. We don't deserve to be happy in spite of decisions that we've made in the past. And those kinds of things actually keep us from wanting to be vulnerable with other people because we don't think we're worthy of taking up space. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about connection, relationship building, healing, and saving lives. And I love to kind of put this all under one umbrella of tribes and trust, because I think that everyone needs a tribe. I think that we all, humans naturally gravitate towards one another. And I think that we all have this inherent need to feel a sense of belonging. And I think that finding our tribes can be a little bit harder of a process than we think. I have personal experience with choosing the wrong type of people to love. And that had a lot to do with not believing that I was worthy of love. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And I'll talk a little bit about how I met some really amazing women and some men who were brave enough to open up to me and share their stories with me, and how that kind of gave me courage and inspiration to really deep dive into changing my life, figuring out who I wanted to be as a human, as a woman, and kind of what happened from there. And then we'll go into some questions. So with all of that being said, I will simply start by saying hi. My name is Shay Huff. I am originally from Atlanta, Georgia, but I've been living in Seattle for, oh my gosh, almost 11 years now. I moved out here. My family thought I was crazy. I'd never even visited the state of Washington before. I decided I wanted to leave my hometown and find myself. And so I moved to Seattle, Washington. I had a friend who'd moved here about a year and a half before I did. He loved it. I really wanted to go about as far away from my family as I could. If you're from a small town, Atlanta's not really a small town. Athens, Georgia is a small town, and that's where most of my family is. So if you have a very large family and you live in a small town, I think you might understand what I mean when I say sometimes you just got to get away. Anyways, so I moved to Seattle with about $400 in my pocket and this desire to discover myself. And 11 years later, here I am. I am a personal and professional development coach. I'm a workshop designer and facilitator, and my areas of focus are vulnerability, of course, self-discovery, healthy boundaries, perfectionism. I love unpacking perfectionism, and defining success based on my own terms, right? Not based on the kind of forced upon terms that society hands to us in this really crazy handbook that have all these conflicting rules and regulations in them. I work mostly with women. Most of my workshops are designed to kind of help women, provide a space for women and girls to start unpacking those things like perfectionism, what it means in my world, how I operate based on my definition of perfectionism, success, what that means in my world, how I operate based on my own definition of success. Am I operating on my own definition of success, or am I operating on the definition of success that was handed to me by society? I love doing that work. I love providing a space for women to really just unpack and feel safe and comfortable sharing their stories. One of the most common things that I hear in my workshops is, I'm so glad that I am not the only one that feels this way. I think there's a lot of secrecy, silence, and judgment, both outward and inward, when it comes to kind of getting vulnerable. And so that's a lot of the work that I do. It has changed my life, and I really can't imagine myself doing anything else. So, my company is called WIM Consulting. The WIM stands for Women's Empowerment Movement. And so that's what I do. I write workshops on my own. I create workshops for schools. And I work one-on-one with clients who want to have a little bit more privacy. So a little backstory on my own personal experience with vulnerability. I grew up really needing to kind of step up and take care of my family. I grew up in an environment that was kind of hectic and chaotic, and my mom wasn't super emotionally available, so I always had to step up and kind of help take care of and manage. And I kind of never really had that experience of being shown love as a child, of being told that I was good, of being told that I was worthy. And that had a huge effect on how I interacted with the world around me. And so basically what happened is I took that kind of mind frame, that frame of mind, into the world with me. So really feeling disconnected, really feeling like there was nowhere that I belonged, really feeling like I really didn't matter much, wasn't worthy, all of those like feelings of like shame and guilt around basically who I was as just a human being. And that looked like anger a lot. It looked like a lot of judging other people and myself. It looked like constantly making comparisons. It looked like never talking about how I really felt. It meant always saying, I'm good, I'm fine, like I got this, I can handle it, I can control it. It looked a lot like having very high walls, very strong boundaries. And there's a difference between having boundaries that are healthy and having boundaries that are meant to kind of isolate you from the world around you. And so that was kind of the way that I operated in the world. And then I got to a point where I was so isolated. I had some associates that I wouldn't necessarily call friends, but I was so isolated that when I started to kind of hit these emotional bottoms, I didn't have anywhere to go. I didn't have anyone to talk to about it. And not only that, I didn't feel like I had the worth, I guess, to kind of talk about what was going on with me. I felt like I kind of needed to, show the world that I got this, I didn't have this, but I didn't know what to do about it because I felt a lot of guilt and shame around the way my life was going. Things were kind of spinning out of control, and I didn't know what to do about it. So when I hit my emotional bottom, I finally got to a point where I was in so much pain that I had to ask for help. And that looked like me turning to a really good friend and just being like, you know what, I'm not okay. And I kind of just like spilled my guts. I don't know how she felt about that at the time, but I felt this huge weight being released, being lifted off of me. I felt like kind of weightless and really afraid. Like, is she going to judge me? Is she going to still want to be my friend? Will she still love me? And I think that was kind of the turning point when I realized that weight being lifted was kind of like, oh, this is really interesting. So I thought that I would feel like the world is ending, right? Like I'm going to get all this judgment. I'm going to be seen as a fraud. I'm going to be seen as someone who's not worthy. I'm going to be seen as someone who is not an adult. And what I got back was this crazy amount of love and acceptance and appreciation. She like told me she appreciated me for sharing my story with her. And then she started to share her own story. She started to talk about how she was feeling, what she was struggling with. And I was just blown away by that. Like, I couldn't believe that all I had to do to feel understood was to share my story. And not only was I understood, but that was reciprocated. And that was truly amazing to me. And so I kind of started to do that a little bit more in other situations in my life. And, there were definitely some times where it was like, okay, maybe I overshared in this situation. But for the most part, it wasn't at all like I thought it would be. There was no like, the wagging finger. Um, there was none of that. It was just total and complete love and acceptance. And so that was really life changing for me. That was when I realized, oh, I don't have to muddle through life on my own. I can actually talk to people about it, and people will respond in kind. Um, yeah, so there's that. My little experience with vulnerability and really feeling like I have to hold the weight of the world on my shoulders, and pleasantly being surprised by the fact that I don't have to do that. Um, when I think about shame and guilt and fear and those feelings of unworthiness, I think about the narrative that we allow to play in our head. Um, I think about the fact that for the most part, when I was going through all that pain, it was mostly me that was telling myself those stories of, if you tell people, they'll judge you. Um, if you're honest, they won't want to be your friends. Um, See, you really can't hold it all together. Why do you need to let people know that? That's secrecy, right? Those were the stories that I was telling myself. But as I became more vocal about what was going on with me, that wasn't the message that I got in return. It was this like complete 180 from what was going on in my head. And so I had to really start to think about the thought processes, right? Those narratives, those stories that I let play in my head. I had to think about how those were showing up in my life and what they were holding me back from. I was the only person who was shaming myself. I was the only person who was making myself feel guilty. I was the only person who was telling myself that I was unworthy. Now, that's my personal story, right? Because we all know that in some of our lives, we do have people that are kind of reiterating that story to us, right? And so we'll talk about connection and relationship building in a little bit. But not only do we have the potential to be toxic towards ourselves, sometimes we invite people into our lives who are toxic to us as well. And that's something that we have to look at as well. So when I think about core values, I think about what is my system of beliefs, right? And so core values is things like honesty. It's things like integrity, setting healthy boundaries, all those things that we kind of hope would show up in our character. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Constantly a work in progress, right? But our core values really can influence how willing we are to be vulnerable. So if I'm willing to be honest with myself all the time about what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling, that might impact my ability to be honest with others about what I'm thinking and feeling. If one of my core values is to always respect myself and respect others, that might impact my ability to be vulnerable with people when I am feeling a disconnect or I am feeling triggered by something that they've said, and I still want to respect them and myself, right? The respecting myself part, that's where you get into vulnerability around being able to be honest and share your story with them or share how you're feeling with them. So thinking about core values can be really important. And I think sometimes those core values might change. And I struggled with that a little bit. I thought I had to have these core values that kind of moved with me throughout life. And I think that those can change. And I think that's really cool, because if your core values are changing, that probably means that you're growing. Changing the narrative and bravery. That one was a really tough one for me. Thinking about changing the narrative, what's coming up for me right now is When I first started paying attention to the narrative that was going on in my head, I was really full of shame. Actually, that's the honest truth. I was full of shame because I had not realized how often I'd been so hard on myself. I didn't realize how negative my thinking was about myself. I didn't realize how often I told myself, you're stupid, you're not pretty, you're not smart, you're uneducated. Uh, and so I gave myself homework around this. And my homework was every time a negative thought comes up, address it, right? First, be aware of it. Because things would come up before and I would just like push it off to the side and pretend like it's not happening. So that's me being vulnerable with myself, right? Kind of sit in the discomfort of, I'm like telling myself I hate myself a lot during the day. And I like being able to be honest about that with myself, right? That was really hard. So like being really honest about the fact that these thoughts are coming up. And then what am I going to do about it? So my homework was every time a negative thought comes into your head, you have to combat it with a positive thought. I found myself doing that so many times a day that I was frustrated. Like I was really frustrated with myself. I was frustrated with the fact that I let this happen. I was frustrated with the fact that I wasn't even aware that this was happening. And I was frustrated with the fact that I couldn't seem to get those negative thoughts to stop. Changing the narrative is difficult. It is a process. It takes time. It takes patience. And it really takes, you have to be relentless. You really have to be relentless. But slowly over time, what I noticed was it would go from having that negative thought to feeling shame, to having that negative thought and being like, okay, here we are again, to having that negative thought to being like, oh no, not you, buddy, we're not doing this today, to having that negative thought to kind of scoffing at it and being like, really, that's the best you got? And so this took about a year, and I'm not saying that it will take a year for everybody, but that's my personal story and my personal process. But once I started changing the narrative around things like how I talk to myself and how I think about myself and how I feel about myself, that actually had a positive effect on my willingness to open up to other people, because I was starting to actually believe that my words, my story has value, right? The things that I've experienced in life, there's value in that. And I was seeing by example from other women and a handful of really amazing guys that I know, the benefits of being vulnerable, right? Like it's actually kind of contagious, which is really amazing. And bravery, man, what comes to mind when I think about bravery, I didn't know how to do that for a long time. So what comes to mind for me, what really helped me in the beginning is fake it till you make it. That's really, really what worked for me. And I gotta be honest, when I first heard that, my biggest beef with fake it till you make it was, well, that's inauthentic. No, that's not gonna work for me. That's just like, that's inauthentic. It's not being honest. It's not showing up as who I really am. And I had a friend that said, if you're constantly showing up as who you are, how are you gonna get to who you want to be? And I was like, well, shit. That's a really good point, because that put things into perspective for me. It changed inauthenticity into practice, right? And that's practical. You have to practice new behaviors. You have to practice new thought processes. You have to practice, if you want to be a great basketball player, you practice that. If you want to be a great gymnast, you practice that. If you want to be a great singer, you practice that. This was no different. So practicing the art of being brave, I really did have to fake it until I made it. I'm actually a huge introvert. I am that person who stays glued to the back wall, not because I don't think I'm worthy of being seen or because I don't think I can take up space. I do take up a lot of space sometimes, but just because that's where I feel my natural environment. Like I like thinking a lot. I like watching people. That sounds creepy. It's not that creepy. But I definitely am an introvert with extroverted tendencies, is what I've been told. Um, and so I don't know where I was going with that. I saw the thumbs up, and my mind was like, "Yay!" uh, yeah, I'm just gonna keep moving. We're just gonna keep it moving. 11:26. Okay. Um, Connection, relationship building, healing, and saving lives. So I'll start with I'll start with connection. Um, for me, connection was something that I always felt that I was lacking, right? Like, how many of us spend so much of our days feeling lonely and disconnected, and like we don't have people we can fully trust, right? We don't have people that we can fully lean on. Um, how many of us feel isolated, right? Um, we want to hang out with other people, right? We want to connect with other people, but there's just something holding us back. For me, that something was me. It was my thinking, it was my system of beliefs. I didn't feel like I was worthy, right? And that word comes up a lot for me, worth, right? I didn't feel like I was worthy of connecting with other people. I didn't feel like I had anything of value to say. Um, and so, when I started kind of leaning into vulnerability, um, suddenly connections started to blossom because people were able to see who I really was. And turns out people like who I really am. And that was surprising to me, right? Like I could tell the truth and still be loved. I could say no and still be loved. That was huge for me. I am a classic textbook people pleaser, right? I needed to do whatever you wanted in order to feel liked. So when I started setting boundaries, talk about a test in vulnerability, setting boundaries and saying, you know what, that's really not going to work for me, and being accepted anyways, that blew my mind. Um, and the more honest you are with people, right, the more honest you are with yourself, right, because that's what allows us to be honest with others, right? We start with self always. The more honest I am with myself, um, the more honest I can be with other people. And the more honest I am with other people, the more they want to connect with me. And so you have this amazing, sometimes weightless, it's like being on a roller coaster, right? When you get to the top and then you start to go down and your stomach somehow is somewhere up in your throat. That is what being vulnerable feels like, right? That's what that process of connection feels like, but we all need that. I need that. I'm assuming that you need that too. Sorry for making assumptions. Um, that was a huge learning curve for me. And when I think about relationship building, I always think about my relationship with myself first. How am I treating myself? How am I thinking about myself? Because I only have the capacity to give what I have. So if I'm not treating myself well, it makes treating others well difficult, right? Or if I'm a people pleaser and I'm not treating myself well, but I'm like ferociously taking care of other people, that's not really sustainable. So when I think about relationship building, I think about what is my relationship with myself? What does that look like today? And what is my capacity to give based on how full my own cup is? And when it comes to vulnerability, relationship building can be trying, right? It can be a struggle. because we all are operating from this point in life where all of our past experiences influence who we are today in this moment, right? And so sometimes there's friction, right, when we bump up against other people. And so being vulnerable and being able to kind of say, hey, this thing that you said impacted me in this way, or this behavior that you act out impacts me in this way, that can be a huge test in vulnerability. It can be a huge test in bravery. It can be a huge test in honesty. But how do I get into a space where I can start, I always like to say dipping a toe. How do I get into a space where I can start dipping a toe into those waters? Like, what are some actions that I can take on my side of the street, as my friends and I say? What are things that I can do to kind of keep my side of the street clean so that I can lean into vulnerability, so that I can lean into relationship building, so that I can lean into bravery? What does that look like for me? And for me, that looks like being aware, right? Being aware of what's happening in my body, being aware of, okay, some pretty strong emotions just came up for me as I'm interacting with this person that I care a lot about. And rather than like projecting that outward, sending that emotion outward, right? That anger or that fear or that frustration, rather than pushing that outward, I always like to stop and take a step back and breathe, right? And like think about where that's coming from. Is it based on a past experience? Is it based on a past relationship? Is there something from my childhood that's coming up? Shout out to my therapist for pointing that one out. What is it that's coming up for me that's causing me to behave in a way that might create a little more distance between myself and this person, when what I really want to do is bring our connection closer together? And all of this stuff takes vulnerability, and sometimes it's exhausting. Sometimes I really just want to like leave things the way they are. I'll like make a mess, in a relationship. And when I say relationship, I mean family, friends, romantic, the whole umbrella, professional. I have a tendency to kind of just be like, well, I don't want to be introspective today. That usually doesn't work out for me. It might work out for you. There's a lot to be said for pausing, right, when we're feeling agitated. But avoidance is definitely not not one of those things that works out well for me. Healing. Man, I have done a lot of healing over the past few years. And it all started with being vulnerable. Sometimes when I think about how hard I tried to hold it all together and how I never wanted anybody to know that I was struggling financially, I was struggling with drinking, I was struggling with, my weight, and like going through these periods of times where I was just like binge eating and then I wouldn't eat at all. I was just struggling across the board. And all I had to do was say, I need help. Sometimes when I think about that, it really just blows my mind. Vulnerability is our pathway to healing. Being able to say, I need help, or can you just listen to me talk, or I'm struggling with this problem and I don't know what to do. That lifts a weight, right? And once that weight is lifted, we have more freedom to move around, right? And also getting it out of our own heads and into the air takes away some of the power, right? We give so much power to our fears. We give so much power to our frustrations. And those things actually keep us in a state of arrested development, right? Because if we're not moving through our fear, if we're not trying to grow in spite of, etc., we're in a state of arrested development. We can't heal. We have tapes playing on repeat in our head. um, those feelings and thoughts of unworthiness, they don't get more quiet. They actually get louder, right? Stunted growth is what that is. And so if you're looking for healing, what you're actually looking for is vulnerability. And I think that that's a really beautiful thing. Um, you know, I always say that vulnerability saves lives. And I think that that's very true. And I'll tell you a personal story. So, oh my goodness, this was 2014. Wow. In November of 2014, I was really struggling with a pretty serious alcohol problem. And I was really secretive about it, right? Because I wanted to figure it out. I wanted to uh, figure out how to control it. Like maybe if I go to the gym more, or maybe if I go to church more, or maybe if I change my eating habits, or maybe if I stop, going out during the week, or, if I, buy cheaper alcohol or only drink at home. I tried all these different methods to kind of mitigate, control, hide this problem that I had. I wouldn't talk to anybody about it because I felt so much shame. Like I felt like I'm a smart person. I should know how to figure this out. Turns out that's not how alcoholism works. But I was so determined, right, to figure it out on my own that I actually dug myself into a pretty deep emotional hole, a financial hole too. And I remember when I started trying to dip my toe into maybe admitting that there's a problem. I started going to these meetings around the corner from my house, and this woman was talking, and she was talking about hope. And she, had this really amazing story that I could not relate to at all. But I love the way that she told it. And I don't remember anything of what she said. The only thing I remember is her saying, coming here gives me the hope that I need to try one more day. And that for me was it, hearing her say that. She also said, knowing that people in here understand how I feel and what I'm thinking gives me hope to try one more day. And I think that was one of the moments when I realized that I didn't have to try so hard to be so strong all the time on my own. Not just with the drinking problem, but with the financial problem, with struggling at work and not wanting to be like, hey, Excel spreadsheets don't make any sense to me. Help. To being able to say, I don't know how to date, and asking for advice from, people who are in successful relationships. That was another one of those moments where I felt like I could start the process of healing. And it was actually because of that woman, right, talking about hope, that I was able to reach out to someone else and say, hey, this is something I'm really struggling with, and I really need help. And then the music starts to play, and, I started digging into recovery, blah, 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 which has been an amazing process. I tell that little snippet of my story to say, right before that happened, on, I think it was November 30th or December 1st, 2014, I'd actually tried to commit suicide. And I tried to commit suicide because I was too afraid to tell anybody that I was struggling. And so whenever I talk about, that experience in my life, I always make it a point to say, this woman, we'll call her Sarah, saved my life. Because if she hadn't been brave enough to say what she said, in that particular meeting that day while I was sitting there with enough presence to actually hear her. I don't know that I would have tried. I don't know that I would have said to anybody, hey, I'm struggling with this. I don't know that I would have had the courage or the hope to believe that in spite of everything that was going on in my life, I can make different choices. And I just found that to be really amazing. So I've done a lot of talking, and I'm actually tired of listening to myself talk. So if I would love to see if anyone has any questions or any feedback or anything that they'd like to share. I'm just going to wait a couple minutes. No, no questions? Mm. Yeah, Cassie, that's great. Would you mind if I read that out loud? I'm sure other people can see it too. I think it's having bad days, so Cassie says, I can really understand what you're saying about having enough hope for one more day. I have bad days sometimes and I keep going. And sometimes I don't really know why, other than I have made it through worse days. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. So I used to, I am a man, I can catastrophize anything, right? Like I can make anything seem like the biggest deal in the world. The whole earth is going to implode. Um, you know, I'm going to suffer a heart attack, whatever, like everything's just going to come falling down around me. And it'll be over something so small. Like I'm 15 minutes late to an appointment, right? Like they're never going to work with me again. They're never going to want to see me again. Um, I am a person who suffers from anxiety from time to time, and I think I really did believe for the longest time that like my feelings could actually kill me. Like I could actually die from my feelings, and that hasn't happened yet, right? So like I'm 35, I haven't died from my feelings yet. So what is it in my head that keeps telling me that this might happen? And I think for me, it ultimately comes down to exactly what you said, Cassie. I've made it through worse days. Like we've made it through worse days and we've come out on the other side, maybe a little bit emotionally scarred. I like to call them battle scars. Um, but other than that, like pretty okay. And my reality is after, those bad days, like what's my capacity to like still find joy, right? Um, what's my capacity to find joy in uncertainty, right? So when there's like big decisions that need to be made or um, I'm afraid I might lose my job, or I have a contract that's ending and I don't know what the next step is, or where am I going to live, or should I stay in this relationship that's like probably toxic? What's my capacity to like move through those events and like still be able to find some joy in life? And I think that has a lot to do with, recognizing and acknowledging that, like, personally, I survived a suicide attempt. I've survived molestation as a small child. I've survived, am surviving an alcohol addiction. There's so many things in my life that I've actually made it through to the other side, and so why can't I trust that I'll be okay uh, in other situations as well? But I think that you make it so simple, Cassie, and I love that because I'm super into like just keeping it simple, right? Like, where am I at today? How do I make it through today? Yesterday's already happened, and I also am a firm believer in our past is for informational purposes only, right? So like we have traumas, there we can get triggered. I'm a huge advocate for therapy. I was a person who was like, I'm never going to go to a therapist. Like, that's crazy. I can figure it out, right? I used to say that a lot. I can figure it out. Oh my God, I wasn't figuring anything out back then. So is that on my teeth or is that on that? That is definitely on my teeth. Sorry, guys. Okay. Yeah, but just really thinking about like, how simple can I make my thought processes? How simple can I, make the way that I manage my life? And sometimes it really is as simple as saying, I've made it through worse days. Like, this is going to be fine. This is going to be totally fine. So thank you for that, Cassie. Ooh, now that some time has passed from your lowest point, what do you tell yourself to keep from thinking something negative on a bad day? Like, oh, this is the best I'll get now. I've plateaued. I really shouldn't act any better. That's a good question. Um, I don't keep myself from thinking negative thoughts because negative thoughts are tied to ego, and there's no way to get rid of the ego. So, what I do is I invite those negative thoughts in for tea. We sit down, we talk about it, and then I tell you that you need to leave. Um, Negative thoughts are going to happen. That's just part of being human, right? Like, that's part of our genetic makeup. Some they happen more for some than they do for others. For this brain, I haven't figured out a way to turn off those negative thoughts. I'm definitely open to it, but I haven't figured it out yet. And so the way that I deal with that is really just to acknowledge it, right? Acknowledge that this is a thought that's coming up for me. And now what am I going to do about it? Am I going to believe it or am I going to question it? Um, am I going to let it run my day and convince me of things that aren't true? Or am I going to beat it with my own truth, right? Like, I know that I'm capable. And my capacity for success, building my career, whatever it is that you want to call it. I'm not a parent, but being a great parent, that's actually not determined by my ego. My personal belief is that that's determined by God, or higher power, or whatever you want to call it. So for me, that's my ego butting its nose in where it has no business doing so. So yeah, I heard that a long time ago, invited in for tea, and then like, yeah, I hear you. I get it. Yeah. Yeah, you think we're worthless. Oh man, that must be rough. Yeah, yeah. Um, do you feel heard now? Do you feel like you've been listened to? Perfect. Okay, well now you gotta go. Now you gotta go. Um, yeah. I hope that makes sense. Let me know if it doesn't. Do I do virtual sessions? I do. I do. Yeah. Yeah, we can, if you have questions about that, feel free to reach out. You can look me up at WIM Consulting on Facebook. My website is www.sheherself.com. sheherwe.com. And yeah, you can email me at wem.sheherwe@gmail.com. Cassie, it's totally okay if you still have bad days. I mean, I think that's kind of part of being human. We have bad days. We have emotional days. We have really good days. The whole spectrum, right? Like, we weren't given all of these emotions for no reason. And they're all kind of indicator feelings anyway. One of the most interesting things that I found out, I used to feel a lot of shame and guilt around being angry. And then I read this book that I found at the library. It was like the 11 types of anger. And I was like, there's 11 types of anger? I thought it was just like, okay, anyways. And I didn't make it all the way through the book because that's the thing I do. I check out a lot of books and then I read like half of them. And then in order to avoid library fees, I take them back to the library before I, have to pay that 5 cents a day. Anyways, one of the most impactful things I read in this book, though, was anger is an indicator feeling. And I was like, whoa, interesting. And then he also said anger is neither good nor bad. It's what we do with that anger that matters. It's our action that's good or bad. And I was like, what? That's crazy. So anger is an indicator feeling. And so is sadness, right? And so is depression. And so is joy, right? And so is happiness. Those are all indicator feelings, right? And our actions are what come out of those feelings. So if you have a bad day, let it be a bad day, right? Like, how do you treat yourself, right? I love that hashtag. What are you gonna do about it? How are you gonna operate in that space? Because sometimes days are just bad. We can turn it around if we want to. We can sit in it if we want to. We can pretend like it's not happening if we want to. We can get into service, right? We can, if I'm having a crappy day, I can call a friend and see what they're up to. Yeah, definitely okay to have a bad day. And I personally believe that I'll always be in recovery. And I have no problem with that. No problem with that. When I got sober, I found out that I'm a person who loves growth, which somehow equates to also loving pain, because there's a lot of pain in growth. I didn't know that before, but it's worth it. It's been worth it. So yeah. I've had a lot of coffee this morning, so I apologize if I'm a little long-winded. Any other comments or questions? I saw some thumbs up. I saw some smiley faces. I saw an angry face and a tear face. Anybody want to elaborate on any of those? We got about 5 minutes left. I'm just realizing there's one thing I forgot to talk about, and I think this is super important. Earlier, I mentioned a personal history of choosing the wrong people to love. Um, that makes it really hard to be vulnerable, right? Like, how many of us have tried to be vulnerable with someone, talk about how we really feel, ask for help, and been met with judgment, um, anger, distancing, um, and as a result, kind of felt like, well, why the hell would I do that again? It took me years, and this is my personal story, right? But it took me years to realize that I wasn't choosing the right kind of people to love, right? Like I wasn't inviting people into my life who had all of those qualities that I myself wanted to embody, right? Um, I'm a person who feels very passionately about compassion for myself and compassion for others, right? I'm a person who very much values um, the concept of always remaining teachable, always remaining open to what the universe can bring, being open to being wrong, right? Being open to being humble and vulnerable and honest. I'm a person who's always been a giver, a person who's always tried to accept others as they are. And when I look back on my history of friends and relationships, those actually weren't the people. Those actually weren't the people that I was inviting into my life. Um, the kind of people that I was inviting into my life were negative, um, sarcastic to a hurtful degree. Usually only wanted to be around me when I could do something for them. Um, and didn't have the capacity, right, to return the love that I was giving them for whatever reason. And that reason can have nothing to do with me and be none of my business. Um, but I was choosing usually really hurt people who only knew how to hurt people uh, to kind of give my love to. And so when you try and open up to someone like that, right? Like when you try and open up to someone who can't even love themselves, um, chances of you getting hurt are higher than normal, right? And so I started seeking out people who modeled those behaviors that I was looking for, that I wanted to embody, not just talking about it, right? These people weren't just talking about compassion and honesty and bravery and vulnerability. They were actually embodying it. They were actually operating in that world on a daily basis. Um, I started seeking out people who actually wanted to know who I was as a human, um, people who would ask me how my day was, right? Who would ask me about my family, who would ask me about work, what's going on with Wim, um, who would ask me about my growth process, people who asked me about my recovery. I started seeking out people who wanted to know me. Um, and I think it's important to watch people. Maybe that's why I'm such an introvert. You have to pay attention to what people do in addition to listening to what they're saying. Because if their actions aren't matching up with their words, the likelihood of them being a reliable person to be vulnerable with is very low. Um, so pay attention to who you're loving, right? Pay attention to how you're loving yourself and pay attention to the people that you're choosing to love, because that's going to show you who you can be vulnerable with. And make sure you're allowing space for other people to be vulnerable with you too, without judgment. What does that look like for you to hold that space without judgment? What does it look like to be better at listening than talking, right? Um, because sometimes people don't need our suggestions, they just need our ears. And it took me a little while to figure that out too. Um, I will get with Stevie about giving you guys my info if that's something that you want. I want to thank you so much for allowing me to take up space today, for allowing me to share my story. Um, I am always open to feedback. I am always open to pushback because that's how I learn and that's how I grow. So if you'd like to send me any info, Stevie will have that info for you, my contact info for you. Thank you all so much. Have a great day.